Okay, thank you very much for joining us tonight in Dearborn Public Library. Uh, we're here to welcome Kostya Kennedy. He's written a great book, The Ride, Paul Revere and the Ride That Saved America. But first, we have a couple of quick announcements. The uh, Please join us on Wednesday, April 9th, next Wednesday. I'll be talking virtually with Susan Morrison about her biography about Lauren Michaels. It's quite a book, great, great book. It's called Lauren, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live. So please join us then. You can register at dearbornlibrary.org. So yeah, I'll be glad. It's great to be talking with Kostya tonight. He's the editor-in-chief of Premium Publishing at Dotdash Meredith. He oversees special editions for under the brands like People, Life, Eating Well, Real Simple, Health, Very Well, Time, and other brands. He's the author of a number of books beyond tonight's book, True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson, 56, Joe DiMaggio, The Last Magic Number in Sports, and Pete Rose, American Dilemma. He's worked on many television shows. He's been on various talk shows. He's earned a MS and journalism from the Columbia University School of Journalism. So please welcome Kostya Kennedy. Well, it's good to be with. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I always like starting the talks with, did you always want to be a writer when you were a kid?
It's a good question. My mother was a novelist. My father was a scientist. He was a psycholinguist, but he spent a lot of time writing on a big yellow pad. And I guess so, words and reading and that whole environment was very much a part of my growing up. I think I wanted, like most people, to be a fireman. I wanted to be a baseball player. I wanted to be a vet. But then I started writing a little bit in high school, and then at college, I worked for the local paper, the school paper, and then the local paper, and that's kind of when I decided I wanted to go into become a writer.
Hey, how did you come up with the idea for the book?
Well, Revere, the ride itself, which people certainly are familiar with, at least in a short version, um, was very compelling to me in that it was a situation of a person knowing sort of exactly what time it was in their life, both personally and in the environment around them, and being called upon to do something at great personal risk, something that could have easily failed, this whole audacious rebellion that the Patriots wanted to have against the royal troops. And meeting that moment so successfully and what went into it. So that was really what drove me there. I think that, like many other people, I remember being read the poem. At kind of an older age, I kind of hung on to wanting to be read to even after I could read because I liked it. And hearing, Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere as a boy of maybe 8 or 9, again, old enough to read, but wanting to be read to. And that I can still see the book. It was kind of a red big volume of poetry that my parents would read to me from. So no pictures, which was kind of a key in that it allowed me to imagine things in my mind. And then when I came to it from a little more of a professional slash intellectual, I guess, framework, it was Paul Revere meeting the moment in the way that he did and understanding what might have happened if he hadn't met the moment in that way that drew me to him and the story of the ride.
Well, you've written other books about similar people in similar situations, like Jackie Robinson, Joe DiMaggio, Pete Rose. Do you think it's like I mean, I'm sorry if I'm reaching here, but do you think it's a conscious choice on your part?
Yeah, you know what, Dan? I want to say how much I appreciate your framing of that question because that's exactly right. Some people say, "Oh, well, you wrote these sports books, and why are you writing this book now?" Which is a perfectly valid question to ask. But I think you see exactly the common thread, whether or not it was an athlete or, in this case, a young patriot or a 40-year-old patriot. There's a lot in common in what in their sort of human task, what confronted them as human beings. So I would say, yes, I don't, when you say conscious choice, I think so. When I'm being asked these questions, I realize that yes, I thought that, but I didn't necessarily think to myself, who can I find who was put to a test in this way? I just more gravitate, I guess, to those stories. Those are the kind of stories I like to read as well, and when I'm reading nonfiction. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That there is a common theme, and it does seem to be something I'm fond of.
Yeah, and everybody has their likes and stuff. It isn't purposeful. It's just what you like.
Right.
Uh, well, as a librarian, I got to talk shop. Describe the different libraries and research sources. Like I majored in history, so it was a big thrill to read this book.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of libraries. I wish I was there with you tonight. I love being in libraries. I love going to them. I love taking books out from them. I love just sitting in them. So I'm with you. I'm a big fan of libraries. And whenever my wife and I travel, like locally, we live in New York, if we go up to Connecticut or someplace, a lot of times what we do is we go into the local library and then we sort of feel like we have a little flavor of the town. So I'm a big fan of libraries. Some of it, quite honestly, Dan, would just go to your local library, and that's a place to start. There's a tremendous amount of access from there. But then I use places such as the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Lexington Historical Society, other smaller, similar athenaeums, and other repositories of information in various towns and various places. The American Revolution obviously was a the transformative event, or our birthing event. So towns, especially in that area, in Massachusetts and throughout New England, have a lot of pride in their role in it or their connection to it. So they keep good records, or they keep records of it. And so I spend a lot of time in those kind of places. Often, I mean, one thing, and again, if we're talking shop, I made an appointment at Massachusetts Historical Society to look at newspapers from 1774 and 1775. And you can see facsimiles, but I wanted to see the actual ones. You have to put on the white cotton gloves. You only get it for a certain amount of time. But there you are holding a newspaper, which for people who haven't seen, it's just basically a one sheet of very small type just running nonstop up and down the page, no pictures or anything. You wonder how people could read them. There weren't eyeglasses in the way that we had. Of course, they had magnifying glasses. But it was a great thrill, a nerdish thrill perhaps, but a great thrill to hold such a paper in my hand and know that people on the streets of Boston 250 years ago were seeing and getting their information right from this very document.
Yeah, I'm very pleased and surprised how they could, with my knowledge and background, that they could uh, have papers from that and actually let people you take a look at them.
Yeah, well, you do have to, again, you have to make a special appointment, and as I said, they have their eye on you to make sure you don't do anything. And the paper is treated at some point, and you may know better than I do how they treat it, but it is given a preservative at some point along the way to prevent
Okay,
decay. But not something that you are aware of. It's not as if it's laminated or anything. You still feel it. So. I don't know exactly the process, but it is preserved, and it's quite a thrill to hold something like that.
sure. So let's move on to the book. What are the misconceptions that most people have for Paul Revere?
Well, I can't speak exactly to what they are, but in terms of, I don't know what's in other people's minds about it. But one of the things in the Longfellow poem that I described, in which for many people, it's their entry into the subject of Paul Revere and the ride. He focuses only on Paul Revere taking the ride. And if you were going to focus on one person, no question, it's Revere. Revere was the principal rider that night, and he was the best express rider the Patriots had. He was the one who went down to rode from Boston to Philadelphia to deliver news of the Tea Party. He brought the Suffolk Resolve to the First Continental Congress. He was their star best express rider. So it makes a lot of sense that he's the focus of his poem. That said, there were that night many other riders, virtually all of them, not entirely all of them, but virtually all of them set in motion by Revere. So he rode from, some people may or may not know the geography of Boston, but he rode from Charlestown, which is just opposite Boston proper, across the river, and rode from there to Lexington, which is about 12 to 14 miles, alerting every house along the way. But when he would alert people, they would get on, not everyone, but sometimes somebody would get on their own horse and go to another town and tell somebody else, who would then go to another town. So by the time Revere was approaching Lexington, there was a sort of network, if you can imagine, of riders going throughout the countryside. Ultimately, about 40 riders rallying people. And that doesn't isn't, I think, immediately known, because people just hear of Revere. But when you think about it, by the time the British were coming back from Concord, the Patriots had 2,000, 3,000 people there, and there's no way that one person sounding the alarm could have rallied that many people that quickly. So that's one major thing, I think, the idea that he was the principal rider, but he was certainly not acting alone.
Well, Revere, you described how he's a very experienced rider.
Yeah.
Uh, you described how he went on his trips to even to Philadelphia one trip, and yeah, you just the whole th the many your description is of everything is very evocative. You can feel the moon and the stars. You can
Thank you so much. That's what grabbed me to it. I mean, there's a certain, it really happened, right? So you get, this person got on a horse and rode these rides, and to go to Philadelphia and back in haste with an important message to deliver, say to the First Continental Congress, was no easy task. It's about 350 miles. He had to change horses along the way. He was clearly physically able. He was a really good horseman. And he was also very trustworthy and very direct by all accounts. There's many descriptions, but there's this one quote from John Adams where he was telling somebody what had happened about something. I'm not going to get into all the details in a letter. And
right.
then he just wrote, Paul Revere will give you the news. And it was so clear in that Revere was good. He was trustworthy, reliable, and they knew that he would tell people what had happened, not embellish, not withhold. And that's also a skill, to be able to do it even unintentionally, to be able to tell a good relay the facts properly. So he would, yes, he did all those things, and I found the rides themselves extremely evocative when he went down to Philadelphia, when he went north into New England, and always, as one might imagine, with the ever-present sense of danger, because pretty soon the British knew who he was, and they knew who he was in London. They'd read about him, and certainly did not want Paul Revere out giving messages about what the Redcoats were doing.
Well, yeah, uh, Mr. Revere is quite a accomplished person. He was a silversmith. He was a dentist at one time, and uh, he got involved. I like how you described his talks with his he joined the local Freemasons. So he's a very well-known man about the town.
And that's really a good thing to bring up, Dan, because that's part of why he was so effective in his ride, because people knew him and he knew people. He knew where to go. He was a very well known. It's hard to be known by face in those times because there's no TV or he was close to the center of the revolution, but there weren't images basically of people. There were portraits certainly, um, but he got around and he had his silversmithing business um, right on the wharf there. He was a Freemason, as you said, very active, rose up the ranks there. And so people knew him. And so on the night of the ride, he knew where to go and who to talk to, and people trusted him. All important. Yes, he was a dentist too, very versatile. He was actually a self-trained dentist, which I don't know about you, but it wouldn't inspire such confidence to me if I was going for a some tooth
Yeah.
treatment. But dentistry was in its earlier forms in those days.
And you even, the portrait that was done of him by John Singleton Copley even had a little sense of humor, I guess, or that's what I took from your
Well,
description.
yes, I felt that he's kind of winking at us in there. Yeah, so the thing that I tried to include in the book all meant to be sort of in service of the ride, meaning I didn't try to include all known thought about Paul Revere, but more things that felt applicable or relevant to the ride. And he had that portrait painted by Copley. And yeah, he's got his hand like this in a way, which is not a gesture that somebody like Paul Revere, who is very much of a sort of blue collar person, would have likely done, not if not in some kind of jest or playfulness. And it's also interesting that he even had that portrait done because it was Copley was already a very prominent and successful painter at that time. And to have one's portrait done by him was costly, mainly with people like John Adams and John Hancock and Samuel Adams and or Thomas Gage, the leader of the British forces. It was not typical that somebody such as Paul Revere would have their portrait painted, but he did.
Okay, let's move towards the ride. And a person that played an integral part was Joseph Warren. And he and Paul Revere, they built up a strong friendship during that time.
Yes, that's a critical relationship for Revere. He met Warren at the Masons. Warren was also a Mason and was at the Masonic house, the chapter that Revere was at. There were two of them, and Revere that one was a little more for artisans and workers, and the other one was a little more higher, sort of upper class, I guess. Warren chose to be at the one for the artisan. And just a little background on Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, he was a very intelligent man who went to Roxbury Latin, went to Harvard, graduated very young as a doctor, very successful medical practice, and also one of the great orators and writers of the time. It was he who chiefly wrote the Suffolk Resolves, and he would give orations every year on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And he really got to know Revere, sort of won his respect through Revere, the very different sort of person. He certainly did not go to Roxbury Latin or to Harvard where Warren went. He went to a trade school, didn't go to college, but he was a very intelligent person and very trustworthy. And they had a great kinship between them. So much so that after Warren died, fairly heroically in the Battle of Bunker Hill, Revere named his next born son Joseph Warren Revere. And Warren was one of the architects of the rebellion, along with the Adamses and Hancock and a few others. And Warren continued to live in Boston at some peril, even after Hancock and Samuel Adams and others had left the town for left Boston for outlying towns.
And he, on the night of April 18th, he summoned Revere to his
Yeah.
house, and because there is getting pretty obvious that the British troops are on the move, whether they not they found out, the rebellion found out by other means, like through General Gage's wife. Uh, but they was on the move, so he was asked, "Hey, can you ride out to Lexington to warn people?"
Yes, that's exactly right. So the fact that the British were up to something was pretty clumsily signaled by the British themselves through various methods, and then sort of errors in judgment by Thomas Gage of ways he chose to deploy people. But and that gets clear in the book. But on the day of what became the ride, on the day of April 18th, there were all these British soldiers, royal troops were mustering and getting ready to go near the water where they would then, when night came, go across the river. And Warren was the one. So people suspected what was going on, but somebody still has to make a decision. All right, we're going to go now, code red or whatever we want to say, and we're going to spring into action. And it was Warren who dispatched Revere and another rider named William Dawes to go out on that night. And even at that point, they didn't know exactly what the British were up to, and quite honestly, neither did many of the royal troops know what they were doing. The very close knit group of people on the British side who were aware of what exactly the mission was. So he went to Lexington, and he went to Lexington because that's where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. They had removed themselves from Boston to go stay there, primarily for safety, and also partly that's where the provincial congress is being held now. When I say safety, just as background, people who don't know, the royal troops had come and were essentially occupying Boston on and off since 1968, and it certainly intensified after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And people would come and sort of vandalize Hancock's house. Hancock was extremely wealthy, essentially funded this area of the Revolution. So he was out there because there was a bounty on their heads of Hancock and Adams that they should be taken in. And he wanted to go and warn them. The British were going there. They were also going to Concord to get some stores, wartime stores such as ammunition and blankets and salted beef and all the kinds of things one might need in such a situation. But yes, it was Warren who gave the go ahead, and Warren who told Revere to go by water. He rowed himself across the Charles River to try to get to Lexington in time.
And then Dawes went by land, right?
Yeah, Dawes went by land, the southern route, and it's interesting because Dawes, who's certainly known by historians, but largely forgotten to sort of popular imagination. Um, Two things about that, Dawes was not nearly as integral. He was a great patriot and he not long before this had stolen a cannon at great risk from the royal troops and given it to the patriots. He was a patriot, but he went out, and for whatever reason, it took him a long time to get there, a lot longer than it took Revere, even though Revere was waylaid along the way. And it doesn't appear that Dawes was successful in actually alerting anyone, or he may have, but they didn't respond. And I say that because there are sort of a roll call, of course incomplete, but largely representative of the people who fought then. So again, just to level set, they rode on the night, and then the next morning is when the troops came to Lexington and came to Concord and came back to Lexington on the morning of April 19th at dawn, essentially. And Dawes along the way as I said, he doesn't seem to have alerted anyone because the soldiers who then showed up, who were registered for having shown up, and many of whom were killed, weren't from any of the towns that he went through, whereas many of them were from the towns that Revere went through, and then the towns sort of adjacent to those. So for whatever reason, that's what happened in that night. And it may partly be what we spoke about earlier, that Revere was much more connected and much savvier in how to do these kind of things.
But he wasn't able to make it to Lexington because he ran into British troops.
Well, he made it to Lexington. He was slowed by a couple of British soldiers who he got away from on the way to Lexington. He got to Lexington, and then when he continued on, and now he continued on with Dawes, who eventually made it to Lexington towards Concord. That's when Revere was, as you say, Dan, he was taken by, um, surrounded by 8 to 11. It's hard to know exactly how many British officers and soldiers, and yes, and he was waylaid.
But he eventually made it. And you mentioned that there were many other writers throughout the New England that alerted people to that fact, even a young 16-year-old girl.
Yes, well, Sybil Ludington is who you're referring to, a 16-year-old girl, and she was a very important figure. There's some question. First of all, her ride was a few years later, it was in 1777, and it was in Connecticut, and she rode to warn of advancing troops, and she unfortunately was not able to alert them in time. They still reached Danbury and basically burnt the town. There's some question as to whether or not she actually existed. There's no mention in her life, um, of her having ridden. She doesn't talk about it in her life. So we're not entirely clear, but in any case, there were many other riders. This is not the kind of thing that, you can do on your own. I'll just Paul Revere again was the primary rider. He was the one who set the things and set everything in motion. But there's no chance we would have had the turnout. The Patriots would have had that kind of turnout or been as successful without other riders. And I want to say, since you drew that nice parallel early on, Dan, if you think of a figure like Jackie Robinson, who was the first African American to play in baseball and bore a lot of that, the pressure and all that. Obviously, African Americans would not have been successful in baseball if it wasn't for many other people being involved. So any of these kind of things, of course, take a team. It takes a village. It takes a lot of people, whatever however we want to phrase it. And certain people sort of become the face of it, and for good reason. In both of those cases, if there was a face, these were the right people to be the face of it. But certainly, there were other riders who were critical to the mission.
Uh, yeah, there was a famous one if by land, two if by sea. And he described going up in the belfry of the Old North Church.
Oh my
It
goodness.
sounded pretty scary.
Well, it was for me. I don't know how people are with heights, but I'm a person who does not like heights. And I wanted to go up there. I had to get special clearance to go there. If people who've been to Boston, or if you want to take a tour, you can go up sort of two levels of essentially normal staircases to a bell room, and they talk to you about everything. But if you want to go higher, you have to get special dispensation. And first, there are some rickety stairs. Then you get to the bells, and then you're going up by ladders all the way up to the tower. And I was quite nervous going up there, and I wanted to go up in part for just sort of experience it and feel it, but understand that that night it was a fellow named Robert Newman, who was the sexton of the church at that time, who went up. That what it took, sometimes if people do know the story, and in the poem he says, he said to his friend, go to the top of the church and hang a lantern as a signal light, one if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be. Uh, but it's not so easy. It's not like, oh, run upstairs and flick the light on for me, right? He had to go up 152 steps in pitch black. When I went, they have very little lighting. It's still very dark, but a little bit of lighting. For Newman, it was pitch black, and he had lanterns, which are quite heavy, strapped around him. He had a tinder box to make sure he could light them when he got there. So it was a pretty intense uh, assignment for him, and I wanted to try to experience that as best I could. That was one of the things I felt I could do in sort of live reporting today, in addition to the archival reporting that we talked about earlier.
So, yeah, let's move on to Longfellow's poem. Uh, there was, I've heard mentioned, I think in your book and others, that Revere is very easy to find rhymes to as opposed to Dawes.
Well, people have said that, and I think that that's said almost to the joke. It's not, first of all, there aren't that many rhymes with Revere in the actual poem. Um, the name, of course, has a certain, first of all, it's Revere, right? Which is a word of great august meaning in our lexicon, apart from being a name. Um, and so he was a certainly it was that poem that name that helped build the poem. But Longfellow knew about what happened that night. He lived in the area. He'd read accounts of what Revere had done, including Revere's own account. And he wrote this poem 85 years later. He wrote it in 1860. So he was looking back on history, and there's no. It's a nice idea that, hey, if Revere had a better name than Dawes, but it would be a little bit strange if he'd written a poem about William Dawes. Now, it wouldn't have been strange if he'd mentioned him at some point, but it would almost be writing a story about Robin instead of Batman. Revere was the central figure, but he does certainly have a name that can be revered, and
Yeah.
that has some resonance.
And yeah, that sort of that became the narrative. That became the story. And uh, I think I was listening to a podcast that you did a few days ago, and a distant and relative or the vice president. There was a vice president of the United States served under Calvin Coolidge by the name of Dawes, and he was related to it, and he
Direct descendant.
made a fuss about it.
Yes, that's exactly right. Dawes was a very prominent family then and now, yeah, much more prominent than Revere, right? If Longfellow wanted to get into the good graces of a family, it would have certainly been the Dawes family. Um, and the Dawes family came over initially in the 1630s, which is when that area was first settled with, direction and support from the king to begin to establish a community in and around Boston and around the river there. But you're absolutely right. Samuel Dawes, who was vice president, brought a renewed attention to the name of William Dawes, and it's definitely a name of sort of prominence and power in if you go back to old ancestral America.
Well, the Revere name these days has it's kind of equal to action. What do you think of if Paul Revere himself was alive today? What would you think of what do you think he would think of his actions during the ride and other things during the Revolutionary War?
I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that before, Dan. I just want to say that's a great observation, right? His name does imply action, right? And among many other things, there's the Paul Revere Pizza uh, chain in Iowa, which is called itself that because it's going to get you delivered your pizza. We'll do it quickly, when it absolutely positively has to be there, kind of thing. So that's a wonderful observation. I think that he would. I think he was very proud of what he did and proud of taking action. But I would also say, and I allude to this in the book, Revere lived a life very adaptive, and always on the go. He lived quite a long life. He lived to be 83 until 1818. After he served in the Massachusetts militia during the war, and he went on to have a very successful bell making business, and then he went into the copper rolling business. And people who are really experts say, his rolling copper for the War of 1812 may have actually had the most impact of anything he did on American liberty and American success. And I bring that up just to say he was very much a man of action. Grass did not grow under this man's feet. Not that night, certainly, and not in general in his life. You brought up earlier the many different jobs he had along the way. He's a man who had 16 children, 11 of whom survived into adulthood. So he was certainly a man of certainly a man of action. I think he'd be very proud of what he did. And I think that, he did not suffer fools. He was blunt in his assessment. He was blunt in his discussion. He told you what he felt. He didn't hold things back. And I think that he would again be proud of what he had done because it was sort of an honest mission. And he, like many other people, of course, took great risk to do what he did, and did it for an ideal that he believed in. So I do think he would be quite proud of what he'd done.
No question. I like the idea. He was a bell ringer, right? And that's quite a that used to be at that time quite a job.
It's a great thing to bring up. We talk about the Old North Church, which is where the lanterns were hung in the place I described going up to. And in 1750, so we're now 25 years before the ride, and Revere is a boy of 15, he had a job at the Old North Church in Boston's North End as a bell ringer. And I included that again. I said I didn't really include everything one might know about his childhood or previous life, but that to me seemed a very resonant time of his life to describe because he was industrious to get himself this job. It was a very particular type of bell ringing. It's called change bell ringing. Not super sophisticated, but it required a certain skill. You ring it, then I ring it, then the next person rings it in a certain order, and it takes a little bit of mastering of the skill. And he wanted to make a little money, and was also resident, and of course with an Old North Church, which became such a critical building and entity in the ride. Uh, but it's also that the act of bell ringing in a church then. Um, it meant something. And today, of course, too, the churches were really a center of activity. So when you're ringing a bell, you're telling people, in many cases, hey, there's something going on here. Somebody just gotten married. There's going to be a town meeting. A meal is going to be served. Something along those lines is what it meant in 1750 to have those bells rung. And that's what he said on the ride was sort of saying, hey, time to get up and come someplace and get to act, which is sort of what a bell ringer is telling people. It's time to get up and act in some way.
Okay. Yeah, that's it just sounded like quite a job,
Yeah.
an important job
Yep.
at that time. So, all righty, we're going to open up for questions both here in the auditorium and online. You can at the on the Q&A, you can submit your questions that way. Got one right here.
Two questions. What kind of species of horse did he like? And did he do his own blacksmith work?
Yeah, you frequently mention in the book how when he did the rides, he would have to trade off horses like every so often. Um,
Yeah, so it's a great question. The horse, so the horses along the way, and we know about some of them. We might know they were gray or they were the color of them. The horse on the night of the ride and probably on other rides was a pacer, a pacing horse that ran in a certain way that made it durable and able to negotiate rough terrain. It was a relatively small horse. It was only 14 hands for those who know the horse lexicon. A British general's horse might have been 16 hands. So it was basically the size of a pony, maybe a little bigger, but stronger. He said it was a very good horse. And it was a borrowed horse. All of his horses were either borrowed or rent. That night it was borrowed. Sometimes it was rented. But he may have had a mare for a time himself, for recreational use, but he rode on these horses that he rented and borrowed. And I think the question had a second part of the question, but could you remind me of what that was?
He was asking, did he do blacksmithing?
He was what was called a silversmith. So he worked in silver and gold. For some reason, even those who worked in gold called themselves silversmiths at that time. So he wasn't a blacksmith proper. Obviously, there's some overlap between those two professions, but he would make you a teapot or a bowl or a dish or cups or things like that. That's what he did.
Okay. Anything that surprised you in your research? Surprised uh, your own view of what Paul Revere was?
Yeah, and I alluded to this a little bit before and talking about Joseph Warren, but when you look at the principal leaders of the revolution in Boston at that time, which is where it all began, obviously then uh, Washington and Jefferson and everybody came in from Virginia, but was sort of the hot spot where it all got underway. And if you look at the leaders there, Hancock, Adams, Warren, James Otis, these were people who went to Roxbury Latin for school, went to Harvard for university, in many cases were very wealthy. I mentioned Hancock. Others had money, had a long pedigree of being in the New World. And Revere, his father came over in the in 1715 or so, as a Frenchman, a Paulus Revoix. He didn't even speak English when he first came over. And he made his way as a silversmith. And then Revere came and made his way as a silversmith. And again, was not highly educated, did not come from a lot of money, did not come from a deep pedigree. And that he was able to, by force of all the things I've sort of been talking about, his reliability, his trustworthiness, his skill, to get himself so close to these people who were really of another class. And I think that America at that time was trying to erase the class system, but it still very much clung from the English times. That was what was really impressive to me, and I hadn't quite understood or had a fix on that he was sort of this person who'd risen above his station in life and been embraced by these people, by these leaders as not quite but almost as one of their own, and that I think was the maybe the most interesting, unusual thing that I came across.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Length of time did it take to do all of your research for this book?
How long did the research take?
I spent a few years on it. It had been, and if there are other writers in the audience, you know this, you have an idea kicking around in your head for some time. So I've been thinking about it and gathering string for however long. It's hard to put a number on that, but I really probably spent about 2 years of research, writing, reporting, pretty rigorously.
Okay. Yep, sir.
Himself down, like memoirs or anything like that about his life experiences and about this event in particular?
I think the question is, did Revere write anything down, especially about the event? And I think as I remember, you mentioned that in the book.
Yes. So he was not super educated. So he wasn't a great orator or anything like that. Certainly a very intelligent person. So most of what we know from Revere is in depositions that he gave, first initially after the event, and then later on in life. People knew what a critical thing it was that he'd done, and they wanted to preserve it. So we have this sort of oral recitation of his night, and there are certainly letters that he wrote, not as many as one might hope, or as a writer might hope to find, along the lines of, say, a Samuel Adams or John Adams, who wrote voluminously. But he did write some letters to his wife and to other people that we have, but not an actual memoir or a real body of work beyond what I've just mentioned.
Okay, let me check here. Uh, Is there a reason why uh, question online, is there a reason why the British were so, lack of a better word, clumsy about about their intent to make an march essentially to Lexington?
It really was a clumsy march, and I can say that Thomas Gage, who was a loyal and excellent British general, uh, did have he had some reservations about attacking the Patriots. He was married to a woman who was born in New Jersey, who he loved very much. He had a lot of sympathies. He had served alongside George Washington in the French and Indian War. Remember, these two sides, the British and the Patriots, who are now so opposed. Not that long before, they'd been as one, maybe 15 years before, fighting against the French. And so it was so there were a lot of friendships and kinships. And I think Gage, he did what needed to be done, but he wasn't as ruthless as he maybe should have been, and for whatever reason he wasn't as attentive to detail. So things like the current in the Charles River, which somebody such as Paul Revere was very aware of, having lived there, they didn't really take it into account, and so the British soldiers who got across the river ended up having to, it took them a little longer to get across, and then the tide came in and they ended up standing in their boots in the water for too long. I think they just weren't quite, it just wasn't quite judgment. Some of it was bad luck, certainly, and some of it was just a miscalculation on the part of Gage and John Pitcairn and others who were involved in leading that march.
Okay, yeah. Okay, two parts, how the accuracy of Longfellow's poem and the where you, and have you been to the Wayside Inn?
Ah, wonderful question. So, Longfellow's poem, the main inaccuracies are of omission, meaning that he didn't mention the other writers. He didn't sort of give a full picture. And he honestly, he didn't mean to. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to tell a story. There are a few other things. He said that the timing of it, he said it was 12 o'clock by the village clock when Revere arrives one place. It was 1 o'clock when he arrives another place. Those are a bit off. He has him getting further along than he did. There's some minor inaccuracies, but but not only the spirit, but the essence of the poem actually is quite accurate when you get into it. I was almost surprised at how accurate it was. It's not 100% accurate. It's not a historical document. It's a poem. So let's set that expectation. But as a poem, it's fairly accurate. I have not been to the Wayside Inn, and Tales from the Wayside Inn would be something I'd like to hear read aloud from the Wayside Inn, but maybe the questioner has been there, and it's certainly on my to-do list of a place I'd love to go.
Okay, anybody else?
And just that was a famous book, a collection that Longfellow did, Tales from the Wayside Inn. That's why.
Yeah, okay, yeah, yep. Uh, it hits me. I was like, yeah, Longfellow.
Yeah.
So, All right. Well, thank you very much, Kostya. It's a wonderful book, very evocative, very enjoyable. I would recommend it. It's available at many independent bookstores like Next Chapter Books in Detroit or literary and bookstore in Ann Arbor. Never can get that straight. Thank you very much for your time and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for everybody who attended in person and online. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. Have a great night.
Thank you.